The neighborhood had always seemed like the kind of place where everything was in order. Manicured lawns, well-kept sidewalks, and neatly painted homes gave the illusion of harmony. New families moved in believing they were joining a community that looked after one another, bound together by the promise of stability through its homeowners association. But behind the freshly trimmed hedges and the carefully worded newsletters, something darker had been brewing for years. At the center of it all was the HOA president. To outsiders, he projected the image of a responsible leader, someone who volunteered countless hours to keep the neighborhood functioning. He ran the meetings with authority, sent out reminders about rules, and handled dues collection personally. Neighbors believed his strict but steady presence was what kept their property values intact. They trusted him because he carried himself with confidence, because he acted as though he always knew what was best for everyone. But trust has a way of being tested, especially when small cracks begin to show. It started with subtle signs, delays in landscaping services, repair projects announced but never completed, and community funds that seemed to vanish into vague categories on the annual budget reports. Residents asked questions, and the president always had answers ready, sharp and convincing. Costs had gone up, contractors were unreliable, and emergencies had drained reserves. His explanations were just believable enough to quiet the crowd, but a few people walked away uneasy. One of them was a longtime resident named Thomas. He had lived in the community long enough to know how things should run, and he had a sharp eye for detail. He began noticing inconsistencies that others overlooked, dues collected but not accounted for, invoices that didn't match the work completed, and financial statements that seemed hastily prepared. At first, he kept his suspicions to himself, watching quietly as the president continued his polished routine. But the more he studied the numbers, the more certain he became that something wasn't right. The tension grew when residents received notice of another dues increase. The president claimed it was necessary to cover rising expenses, but the reasoning felt flimsy. People grumbled, but most paid without much resistance. To them, it was easier to comply than to challenge authority, but Thomas couldn't let it go. He began collecting every document the HOA sent, comparing budgets from year to year, looking for patterns. What he uncovered wasn't just sloppiness. It was a trail that pointed to something far worse. The president had been siphoning money. It wasn't obvious at first glance, but the discrepancies were there for anyone willing to dig deep enough. Inflated contractor fees, duplicate charges, vague, miscellaneous expenses that conveniently appeared every quarter, all signs of funds being diverted somewhere they didn't belong. Thomas realized the president wasn't just incompetent, he was corrupt. But proving it was another matter. The board trusted the president implicitly, and most residents were too tired or too busy to investigate. Confronting him directly would only lead to denials and cover-ups. If Thomas wanted to expose the truth, he would need undeniable evidence, something that couldn't be explained away with polished words or fake invoices. And that meant going beyond simple observation. So he began planning something bold, an undercover sting operation. He started small, testing the system by making payments in a way that could be traced differently than the usual checks or online transfers. He documented every interaction, every receipt, every email. He spoke casually with neighbors, encouraging them to pay close attention to their own statements, planting seeds of awareness without tipping his full hand. Slowly, he built a case, piece by piece, while keeping his suspicions quiet. The neighborhood carried on unaware, but beneath the calm surface, a quiet storm was forming. The president continued his reign, certain of his untouchable position, while Thomas carefully constructed the trap that would one day bring everything crashing down. Each step he took brought him closer to exposing the theft that had bled the community dry for years, and as the months passed, the balance of power began to shift. The president didn't know it yet, but his carefully crafted image was about to be shattered. The sting operation was just beginning, and the evidence would soon tell a story far louder than his excuses ever could. The stage was set for a battle that would shake the very foundation of the neighborhood, a war between secrecy and truth, corruption and accountability. And in that war, the first shot had just been fired. Thomas knew that suspicion alone would never be enough to bring down the president. In the world of HOAs, accusations without proof were dismissed as petty grudges, and anyone who spoke out too boldly risked being branded a troublemaker. If he wanted the neighborhood to believe him, he needed a plan that was as meticulous as the corruption he was trying to expose. The first step was information gathering. He requested copies of the HOA's annual financial statements, citing his rights as a paying member of the community. The president seemed slightly irritated but obliged, handing over a packet of spreadsheets filled with numbers and vague expense categories. To most people, it was incomprehensible paperwork, but to Thomas, it was a gold mine. He sat at his kitchen table late into the night, comparing figures, circling inconsistencies, and mapping out patterns that seemed to point toward deliberate manipulation. One thing that stood out immediately was the landscaping budget. Year after year, the cost had supposedly increased, yet the quality of service had noticeably declined. Weeds went untreated, hedges were left overgrown, and seasonal flowers that used to brighten the entrances were nowhere to be seen. Thomas cross-referenced the invoices and noticed they all came from the same company, a small landscaping firm with almost no online presence. That struck him as odd. If the HOA was truly spending that much money, why weren't they hiring a reputable company with proper licensing and references? This was the thread he decided to pull first. He visited the address listed on the invoices, only to find a rundown property with no signage and no evidence of active business operations. It was the kind of place used as a shell to funnel money. He took photos, documented his visit, and added it to his growing file of evidence. But he needed more than suspicious paperwork and shady contractors. He needed to catch the president in the act. To do that, Thomas devised a test. For his next HOA dues payment, he wrote a check but left a discreet watermark on the back, something only he would recognize. He then documented the check number and tracked it through his bank account. If the money ended up deposited anywhere other than the official HOA account, he would know. Weeks later, when the payment cleared, his suspicions deepened. The endorsement stamp didn't match the official HOA records he had from previous years. It was subtle, but the account name was slightly different, close enough to pass unnoticed by casual eyes but not identical. Thomas realized the president may have been routing some payments into a shadow account under a similar name. It was a clever move, but not clever enough to escape his scrutiny. Still, Thomas knew he couldn't do this alone. If the president discovered he was investigating, he could easily be discredited or even targeted with bogus violations. So he quietly reached out to a few trusted neighbors, people who had also grumbled about the rising dues and declining services. Instead of accusing the president outright, he framed his questions carefully. Had they noticed delays in repairs? Had their checks cleared properly? Had they ever asked to see detailed receipts? Slowly, the neighbors began to share their own stories, each one adding weight to Thomas's growing suspicions. One neighbor complained about paying for a roof repair on a community building that never seemed to happen. Another recalled being told the reserve fund was low because of unexpected emergencies, yet no one could remember what those emergencies had been. Piece by piece, the puzzle was coming together, and the picture it revealed was damning. But Thomas knew hearsay wouldn't be enough. He needed irrefutable evidence, something undeniable that even the most loyal supporters of the president couldn't ignore. That's when he decided to escalate his plan. Instead of simply tracking his own payments, he convinced a few neighbors to participate in a controlled test. They agreed to make their dues payments in slightly different forms, one by check with unique markings, another by money order, and another through the online portal with screen recordings of every step. Thomas would then collect the documentation and track where the funds ended up. It was risky. If the president grew suspicious of the unusual payments, he might catch on to what Thomas was doing. But the risk was worth it. The only way to expose corruption was to shine a light so bright it couldn't be ignored. The trap was slowly being set, and Thomas could feel the weight of what he was about to uncover. This wasn't just about money. It was about trust, about a man who had built his reputation on control and authority while secretly exploiting the very community he claimed to serve. What Thomas didn't yet know was how deep the corruption ran, or how far the president would go to protect his secrets. For now, though, the plan was in motion, and the evidence was starting to pile up. The sting operation was no longer an idea, it was a living, breathing effort, and once it reached the point of no return, there would be no stopping it. The neighborhood carried on as usual, children playing in driveways, neighbors mowing lawns, and the president smiling confidently as he waved at passing cars. But beneath that facade, the foundation was beginning to crack. The web of lies that had held everything together was unraveling, and Thomas was pulling the threads tighter with every step. The time for patience was coming to an end. Soon, the evidence would reach a tipping point, and the president's carefully constructed empire would begin to collapse. And as Thomas filed away the latest batch of documents, he knew the moment of truth was drawing closer. The president might think he was untouchable, but the sting operation was tightening around him, and there was no escape. The stage was set for the next phase, where suspicion would turn into proof, and whispers would become undeniable facts. The documents Thomas had collected were already painting a troubling picture, but what came next pushed the situation from suspicion into undeniable reality. As he cross-referenced the unique payments made by his small circle of trusted neighbors, the results showed clear manipulation. The check with his hidden watermark had been deposited into the shadow account again. The money order from another neighbor was also processed strangely, marked as received in the HOA ledger but never appearing in the official account summary. And the online portal payment, recorded carefully through screenshots and time-stamped videos, vanished without a trace, marked only as pending for weeks before eventually disappearing altogether. It was no longer just sloppy accounting, it was deliberate theft. The president had built a system that allowed him to siphon off funds in multiple ways, all while convincing the board and the community that everything was above board. The brazenness of it was staggering, but what stunned Thomas most was how easily the fraud could have gone unnoticed. Most residents simply paid their dues, assumed the money was going to the right place, and never questioned it again. They trusted the reports at face value. That trust had given the president free rein to quietly build his scheme into something larger than anyone could have imagined. Thomas knew that with what he had gathered so far, he could already make a strong case. But something nagged at him. If the president had been stealing for this long, it was unlikely he was acting alone. After all, no one could manage an entire association's finances without at least some cooperation. That was when Thomas began digging into the rest of the board. He attended the next HOA meeting, careful to remain inconspicuous. The president sat at the head of the table, confident and polished as always, flanked by board members who nodded along with every word. Thomas paid close attention to their interactions, noting who seemed too eager to agree and who avoided eye contact. He noticed one board member in particular, the treasurer, who rarely spoke and yet handled all of the financial paperwork. Every time a question about the budget came up, the treasurer slid a folder across the table and the president spoke for him. It was as though the treasurer's role was nothing more than a silent rubber stamp. That silence was suspicious. If anyone should have been concerned about the financial discrepancies, it was the treasurer. Yet he never asked questions, never raised concerns. Thomas began to suspect that the treasurer wasn't just complacent, he was complicit. To test this theory, Thomas requested access to receipts for recent community projects, again exercising his rights as a member. He was given a stack of documents, but many of them were obvious forgeries. Generic letterheads, missing tax identification numbers, and vague descriptions like repairs completed without any detail. A quick search of the listed vendors revealed that several of them didn't exist at all. These were fake companies, shells used to launder the stolen money, and the treasurer's signature appeared on every single one. The scale of the corruption was overwhelming. This wasn't just one man skimming off the top. It was a coordinated scheme, an operation built to extract as much as possible from the community while hiding behind the facade of authority. Thomas realized the danger he was in. If the president and the treasurer suspected he was investigating, they could retaliate. They controlled the rules, the violations, and the fines. They could bury him in harassment or worse, discredit him before the entire neighborhood. He had to move carefully, ensuring that every step he took was backed by evidence too strong to ignore. With each discovery, Thomas expanded his sting. He began recording board meetings, capturing the president's confident reassurances and the treasurer's silent compliance. He photographed the fake invoices and kept copies of every suspicious transaction. He even spoke quietly with a retired accountant in the neighborhood, asking him to review the records. The accountant confirmed what Thomas already suspected. The numbers were deliberately manipulated, and the funds were being drained systematically. But perhaps the most shocking discovery came when Thomas traced one of the shell companies further. He followed the paperwork trail until it led him to a property outside the neighborhood, an upscale house that, according to county records, belonged to the president's cousin. The so-called contractor, being paid thousands of dollars in HOA funds, was nothing more than a relative set up as a middleman. The money flowed from the resident's pockets, through fake invoices, and straight into the president's family accounts. The corruption wasn't just deep, it was personal. Now Thomas understood why the president carried himself with such confidence. He wasn't simply running an HOA, he was running it like a private business, one that enriched him and his allies at the expense of every single homeowner. And for years no one had questioned it. But things were different now. The sting operation was exposing more than Thomas had ever imagined, and with each new discovery the stakes grew higher. If he moved too soon, the president might cover his tracks. If he waited too long, the corruption might spiral further out of control. The balance of power in the neighborhood was shifting, though only Thomas could see it. Behind closed doors, in files and bank records, the truth was building like a tidal wave, waiting for the right moment to crash down. As Thomas organized his growing mountain of evidence, he knew the time was coming when he would no longer be able to work in the shadows. At some point, the corruption would have to be dragged into the light for everyone to see. And when that day came, the president's reign over the neighborhood would end in spectacular fashion. For now, though, the operation had to remain secret. The president believed he was untouchable, and that illusion would be his undoing. The stage was being set for a confrontation unlike anything the neighborhood had ever seen, and Thomas was ready. By the time Thomas had gathered months of documentation, his sting operation had become a delicate balancing act. Every piece of evidence he collected brought him closer to exposing the president, but it also increased the risk of being discovered. And in a neighborhood where gossip traveled faster than the wind, secrecy was becoming harder to maintain. The president, who had always exuded calm confidence, began showing signs of unease. Subtle at first, like sharp glances around the room during board meetings or his tendency to cut off any questions before they could linger. Then, more noticeable changes emerged. He started sending out extra violation notices, seemingly at random, as if testing the loyalty of residents and asserting control. When a neighbor casually questioned the use of HOA funds for a project that never materialized, the president shut down the conversation with unusual aggression, his polished smile slipping for a brief, revealing moment. Thomas recognized the signs immediately. The president was becoming suspicious. He didn't know yet who was digging, but he could sense that someone was looking too closely. This made the next phase of the sting even more dangerous. To keep suspicions at bay, Thomas played his role carefully. Outwardly, he acted like any other resident, grumbling mildly about dues increases but never raising his voice. He even allowed himself to receive a bogus violation notice for his trash bins being left out too long. Instead of challenging it, he paid the fine without protest, knowing that drawing attention now could jeopardize everything. Meanwhile, his evidence pile was becoming too large to ignore. The fake contractors, the shadow account, the treasurer's complicit signature, all of it painted a damning picture. But what he lacked was the moment of undeniable proof, the smoking gun that would silence even the staunchest defenders of the president. He needed to catch them in real time, transferring money or fabricating invoices, something irrefutable. That opportunity came sooner than he expected. At the next board meeting, the president announced that a major repair was urgently needed on the community clubhouse roof. He claimed that the storm season had caused extensive damage and that emergency funds would have to be used immediately. Thomas's stomach tightened. There hadn't been any significant storms in months. The timing felt contrived, almost desperate, as though the president needed to justify another large withdrawal before anyone caught on. After the meeting, Thomas quietly visited the clubhouse. The roof was perfectly fine. No leaks, no missing shingles, no damage of any kind. He documented the entire structure with photographs and videos, every angle showing clear, intact roofing. It was the perfect setup for another fake invoice. The trap was practically building itself. Thomas anticipated that within days, an invoice for emergency roof repairs would appear in the financial records, paid out to yet another shell contractor. If he could intercept that document and compare it against the proof of an undamaged roof, it would be devastating evidence. But while Thomas prepared to tighten the noose, the president seemed to be closing in as well. He began showing up unexpectedly around the neighborhood, stopping to chat with residents in a way that felt less like neighborly concern and more like probing for information. One evening, Thomas noticed him slowly driving past his house, eyes fixed on the driveway for longer than necessary. The message was subtle, but clear. He was watching. The tension spread beyond Thomas's private investigation. Neighbors who had quietly joined the sting began feeling the pressure. One confided to Thomas that they'd received multiple notices in a single week for trivial violations that had never been enforced before. Another admitted they were afraid of being targeted if the president discovered their involvement. Thomas reassured them as best he could, but inside he knew the stakes were climbing. Still, he pressed forward. He created hidden backups of all his evidence, storing files on secure drives and even giving copies to a trusted friend outside the neighborhood. If anything happened, if the president tried to intimidate him or bury him in fines, the truth would survive. Sure enough, just days later, the emergency roof repair invoice appeared. Dated and signed by the treasurer, it claimed thousands of dollars in repairs had been completed by a contractor whose address traced back to yet another residential home with no business license. The payment was already processed, the funds withdrawn, and the ledger updated as though everything were normal. But this time, Thomas was ready. He had the before and after photos, time-stamped and undeniable, proving that the repair had never taken place. He had the fake contractor's address, linking the scheme back to the president's web of fabricated companies. And he had the paper trail of the funds vanishing into the shadow account. The evidence was no longer circumstantial. It was concrete, explosive, and dangerous. For the first time, Thomas felt the balance of power shift. The president could no longer explain away missing funds with polished words or dismiss concerns with charm. The sting had worked, and the trap had closed around him. But Thomas also knew that exposing the corruption wouldn't be as simple as handing over the documents. The president had power, allies, and influence. If the confrontation wasn't handled carefully, the truth could be buried under intimidation, legal threats, or worse. The time for secrecy was nearly over. The sting had reached its breaking point, and the neighborhood was on the edge of a revelation that would change everything. As Thomas filed the roof evidence into his growing case, he understood that the coming confrontation wouldn't just expose corruption, it would decide who truly controlled the community. And in that moment, he realized something else. The president wouldn't go down quietly. The evidence Thomas had collected was ironclad, but exposing the president would not be as simple as placing a folder of documents on the table. The president had spent years cultivating control over the neighborhood, weaving a net of intimidation and false authority. He had loyal supporters on the board who owed him favors, and others who simply feared what might happen if they challenged him. Bringing the truth into the light would mean tearing down that entire facade, and Thomas knew the confrontation could easily turn into a battle of narratives. One man's accusation against a polished authority figure. Still, the time for shadows was over. With the fabricated roof repair fresh in his files, Thomas prepared to move forward. He contacted the small group of neighbors who had quietly assisted him and presented the completed case. For the first time, they saw the scheme in full: fake invoices, shell companies, altered bank deposits, and undeniable proof that their dues had been siphoned away for years. Their shock quickly turned to outrage. Many had tolerated the rising fees and declining services because they believed they were temporary struggles, but now they understood the betrayal. The group agreed that the evidence needed to be presented publicly. A quiet submission to the board would only allow the president to bury it. They needed to create a moment so undeniable that the entire neighborhood would see the truth at once. That opportunity came with the annual HOA meeting, an event attended by nearly every resident, where the budget was presented and votes were cast for board positions. It was the perfect stage. In the days leading up to the meeting, Thomas felt the tension rise. The president seemed unusually active, sending out polished newsletters boasting about ongoing improvements and fiscal responsibility. He paraded around the neighborhood with his usual smile, as though sensing a challenge and trying to reassert dominance. But behind the smile, there were cracks: longer boardroom sessions, abrupt arguments with the treasurer, and sudden surges of violation notices targeting anyone who had even whispered dissent. Thomas stayed quiet, biding his time, while secretly making copies of his evidence package for distribution at the meeting. He even created a slideshow presentation to clearly lay out the scheme step by step, ensuring no one could dismiss it as confusion or exaggeration. The night of the meeting arrived, and the clubhouse was packed. Residents sat shoulder to shoulder, fanning themselves with paper agendas as the president stood at the front of the room, confident as ever. He began his presentation with the usual charm, speaking of community spirit, rising property values, and the importance of staying united. The treasurer sat silently beside him, a stack of financial statements laid neatly in front. But when the budget discussion reached the topic of the clubhouse roof repairs, Thomas made his move. He stood from his seat and announced that he had evidence the repairs had never taken place. A wave of murmurs swept through the crowd. The president laughed dismissively, attempting to frame the interruption as a misunderstanding. But Thomas calmly walked to the front of the room and connected his laptop to the projector. What followed was a dismantling of the president's empire in real time. Slide after slide showed invoices signed by the treasurer, photos of untouched repairs, contractor addresses leading to residential homes, and bank statements with shadow accounts. The room grew quiet, the usual rustle of papers and whispered side conversations replaced by stunned silence. Faces shifted from confusion to anger as the scale of the corruption became undeniable. The president tried to interject, claiming the documents were taken out of context, but Thomas anticipated every excuse. He displayed time-stamped videos, notarized statements from neighbors, and even side-by-side comparisons of signatures, proving deliberate forgery. Each attempt to deflect only made the president look more desperate. Then came the final blow. Thomas revealed that one of the fake contractors was linked directly to the president's cousin, proving beyond doubt that the scheme was personal profit, not administrative error. Gasps echoed through the room. The treasurer lowered his head, unable to meet anyone's eyes, while the president's carefully polished image began to collapse before his very neighbors. The meeting descended into chaos. Residents shouted questions, demanding answers for years of stolen money. Some slammed their fists on tables, furious at the betrayal. Others whispered among themselves, already considering legal action. The president, red-faced and cornered, tried to regain control of the room, but the tide had shifted irreversibly. His charm no longer worked. His excuses no longer carried weight. For the first time in years, the authority he wielded so effortlessly was gone. The neighbors who once nodded obediently now glared with suspicion and disgust. The treasurer, realizing the scheme was finished, muttered a weak resignation before fleeing the clubhouse. But the president did not step down. Instead, his composure snapped. He lashed out at Thomas, accusing him of staging the entire operation out of jealousy and personal vendetta. He claimed the evidence was fabricated, that Thomas had manipulated data to create the illusion of theft. Yet the louder he shouted, the more desperate he appeared. Thomas, calm and steady, said nothing more. The evidence spoke louder than any argument. The crowd had seen the truth with their own eyes, and no amount of bluster could erase it. The meeting ended in uproar. The board was forced into an emergency vote, and for the first time in the neighborhood's history, the president's position was formally challenged on the spot. Residents who had once feared speaking out now raised their voices with determination. The illusion of control had shattered, and the sting operation had delivered its blow. But Thomas knew the fight was not over. The president still held influence, and a desperate man backed into a corner was dangerous. The next days would decide everything, whether justice would prevail or whether the president would use every trick he had left to cling to power. The sting had exposed the corruption. Now came the battle for what would follow. The aftermath of the explosive annual meeting rippled through the neighborhood like a storm that refused to die down. For years, residents had accepted dues increases and neglected services with little more than grumbling, but now their patience had snapped. The sting operation had stripped away the glossy facade of order, exposing years of deception, greed, and betrayal. The neighborhood was united, not under the president's control, but against him. Within days, conversations on porches and sidewalks centered only on one subject: the stolen funds. Neighbors compared notes, recalling times when repairs had been delayed, fines had been issued unfairly, or services had quietly disappeared. Each memory, once brushed off as inconvenience, now took on new meaning under the light of corruption. The anger was overwhelming, and it grew with each passing day. The board, shaken by the public backlash, convened an emergency session without the president. The treasurer, realizing the legal implications of his forged signatures, had already resigned and gone silent, refusing to return calls. That left the president isolated, fighting alone against a tidal wave of outrage. Yet he refused to step down. Instead, he doubled down on his defense, sending out letters to residents accusing Thomas of manipulation and warning that the so-called evidence was a smear campaign designed to destabilize the community. But his words fell flat. The evidence Thomas presented had been too thorough, too precise to ignore. Neighbors who once nodded obediently now tossed his letters straight into the trash. Trust had been shattered, and no amount of charm or intimidation could repair it. The breaking point came when Thomas and several residents filed a formal complaint with county authorities, submitting the entire body of evidence. What had started as a quiet sting operation had now escalated into a full legal investigation. Auditors were assigned, subpoenas were issued, and suddenly, the president's carefully constructed empire was no longer just a neighborhood dispute. It was a matter for law enforcement. Investigators pored over the records, quickly uncovering the same shell companies, forged invoices, and fraudulent accounts Thomas had documented. The paper trail was undeniable. The president's cousin was linked directly to the bogus contractors, and the treasurer's signatures connected him to every false transaction. Years of stolen funds were mapped out in neat lines across the investigators' reports, each dollar accounted for and traced back to the corruption at the top. When the news spread that charges were imminent, the neighborhood erupted in vindication. Residents who had felt powerless under the weight of unfair fines and arbitrary rules finally saw justice on the horizon. Property owners began to rally for reform, demanding transparency, new leadership, and an end to the culture of fear that had dominated their lives. For Thomas, the moment was bittersweet. The sting operation had succeeded, but it had come at a cost. He had endured months of stress, secrecy, and the constant fear of discovery. He had watched neighbors struggle under harassment and intimidation, but seeing the president's once commanding presence reduced to a man cornered by his own lies made every sleepless night worth it. The final blow came when authorities arrived at the president's home. Neighbors watched from their driveways as officers escorted him out, no longer the polished figurehead but a disgraced leader whose arrogance had finally caught up to him. The sight was both shocking and cathartic. The man who had ruled their community through deception and intimidation was now powerless, his fate in the hands of the justice system. In the weeks that followed, the HOA underwent a transformation. New elections were held, with residents stepping forward to form a board committed to transparency and accountability. Financial records were made accessible to all, and independent auditors were brought in to ensure the association would never again be abused for personal gain. The culture of fear that once silenced the neighborhood began to dissolve, replaced by open dialogue and cautious optimism. For Thomas, life slowly returned to normal. His neighbors, once skeptical of his persistence, now thanked him for his determination and bravery. He never sought recognition, but the community saw him as the man who had restored their trust and reclaimed their neighborhood from corruption. And yet, the story of the corrupt president lingered as a warning. It was a reminder that even in the most picture-perfect communities, power unchecked could breed greed and trust could be exploited. But it was also proof that one determined resident, armed with patience, evidence, and courage, could stand against corruption and prevail. The sting operation had not only exposed the theft, it had reshaped the neighborhood forever. And while the disgraced president faced the consequences of his actions in a courtroom far from the manicured lawns he once controlled, the residents he betrayed carried on, finally free from the shadow of his deception. The community had survived the storm, and in its place, something stronger had taken root.